And so again, because if I just go, oh, I'm such an idiot or I'm such an a-hole or something like that, again, I'm shaming myself, and shame does not motivate change, right? Shame just brings you down lower, and it makes it harder to climb back up into the person that you want to be and live in line with the values that you want to have.
Hello, and welcome to Awake at the Wheel. So this time of year is often difficult for many clients in therapy. Mother's Day and Father's Day, while is meant to be a happy occasion to celebrate parents, oftentimes it brings up a lot of hurt feelings, sadness, regret, guilt, you name it. Lots of difficult feelings can come up. So we think that it's important for us to address it given the time of year that we're at right now. So oftentimes we hear the terms mommy issues and daddy issues thrown around to, refer to what we know clinically as attachment issues. The relationships that one has with their mother and father, while equally important, are very different. And therefore, the wounds from those attachments or lack of attachment can show up very differently throughout childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So, Oren, I'm wondering if first you can give our listeners a little bit of background about maybe what some of historically what Freud has said, what Jung has said about the attachment and mothers, fathers, and those relationships.
Yikes. That would take quite a long time. So I'll try to give a very shortened, let's say, compiled version. Also looking at object relations and so on. I mean, so because with Freud, he went off on the rails.
We could go on for hours, yeah.
So basically, the idea that who we are, how we see ourselves, our place in society, in the world, and so on, is basically an internalization of the relationship that we form, the attachments, the bonds, with our, let's say, our significant others, our parents. That again, our sense of self is directly related, whether it's identifying with the parent, whether they're a loving parent or a cruel parent, and so on, whether it's distancing ourselves and dissociating ourselves from those, and doing the opposite, doing what's called a reaction formation, being very different from what we're seeing in them, in the way they model, and the way the behaviors, the way they're being and modeling, and so on. Okay, it's a lot about what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. There's so much there that I'm trying to kind of really summarize it. But the idea being that as we are growing and developing, our relationship with our parents goes through these transitions as well, and they are the ones who are supposed to help us navigate these different stages of early development. And the way that they do that either helps us get through those stages in a healthy manner, or Freud had this term called cathexed, or we become fixated. And again, I don't want to give too much credence to some of his theories, because what he observed was fascinating and I think was really accurate, but the explanations he gave seemed to almost be mythical at times, or went off the rails, or were very, let's say, idiosyncratic interpretations of what he was seeing or hearing about. So the point being, so forget the specifics, the idea that as we go through, again, these different stages in our early childhood, even in our teen years and beyond, like that, if we make it through in a healthy way, then we become a better functioning person. If, however, there are crises or traumas within those different stages, they kind of get stuck with us, and we carry them, internally, unconsciously, mostly, maybe somewhat consciously, and we spend the rest of our lives pretty much trying to either heal them, work them out, process them, learn how to deal with them better. And in many cases, without significant help, we just keep repeating the same unhealthy early dynamics in our later relationships. So if that's kind of a nutshell, but the whole idea is, again, that we're trying to work out all of these different stages that we go through, all of the different problems, the interpersonal problems that develop in those stages. And again, once again, the internalization of all of this shaping who we are, or how we see ourselves, and how we see ourselves in relation to others, and also what other people represent to us. Are they people to be loved? Are they people to be trusted? Are they people to be conquered and controlled, and so on? So that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way that the narrative is in the current climate, I think that we've gotten away from the fact that there are different roles that mothers and fathers play in a child's life, right? So yes, we all want to believe that everyone's equal, but equal doesn't mean the same. Necessarily. So typically when we're looking at, the father wound, for example, that can arise from either a father's complete absence from a child's life, or there could be physical presence but lack of emotional connection, or dismissal, emotional neglect, criticism, and things such as that. With mothers, however, often that wound can show up and arise from the meeting of physical needs, but not the meeting of emotional needs. So, for example, if a child falls and scrapes their knee, mom is there to help attend to that physical need. But, if they break up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, mom's not there to comfort them, console them, and so on. And obviously, there's far more complexity to it, but I think that those are the two nuances of it to be aware of.
Well, and that's the problem that people either I think they're neglecting the reality that if you look at other primates, for example, yes, the mother and the father play different roles, and they're different with males and the females as well. And so, yes, in society today, we're pretending that and nothing against people who have different types of, let's say, families,
Of course.
or right couplings and so on. Like all the power to you, but two moms are going to be different from a mom and a dad, okay, or a single mom or a single dad will be different from having the two. And and just take another step. So if you introduce a step parent, there's a whole a plethora of studies and literature on what that does and how to navigate that. So for people, once again, to pretend that it's a body, and one body is the same as two bodies, or two male bodies are the same as male and female, it completely, I think, it ignores the reality of humanity, and again, other species as well. And it's not just primates, other animals. And but just again, I'm throwing this out there. All right, if you had, for example, a mother and a grandmother, and that grandmother was tough as nails. She was the authoritarian. She was, that she made sure that you did your homework, or that you didn't mouth off to mom or something like that. Yeah, you probably could in many ways have the same type of healthy sense of self and understanding of how society works as if you had a mother and a father at the same time. So I'm not saying that it's a necessity. It has to be this, mother and father, but you do need to have these authority figures playing certain roles and tending to certain needs, as you say, whether it's the emotional need, whether it's the discipline, whether it's structure, guidance, strength, whatever it happens to be. And yes, you could have, you could have two men who are both very weak if it's a partner, right? And that's going to cause problems. Or having a husband, mother and father, they can be unfit parents. So I'm just saying that for anybody. And I know, because people will automatically get their backs up if, how dare you say that the traditional family structure is superior? Well, I'm not saying it's superior, because there's a lot of examples where it's not. But I'm saying that the traditional family structure, if done right, meets these different needs. And all these different needs are, again, actualized through the different roles that the parents are supposed to play.
Yeah, so oftentimes I think that people have preconceived notions about what these attachment issues can look like in adulthood. So I think the typical picture of somebody with, quote, daddy issues is someone who is, in serial relationships with men, and they're trying to fill that void, or, behaving in certain ways to get the attention of men, for example. But I think that there's a lot of unexpected ways that we as clinicians see this type of wound showing up. So, for example, people pleasing, perfectionism, never feeling like one is good enough, an excessive fixation on achievement. So these are all, objectively or at least outwardly seeming positive things, but can very much be a direct response to these wounds.
Right. And that's where again, almost contradicting myself, but it's not, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter if it's a male or a female, mom and dad. Either parent or any caregiver can inflict these wounds on children, right? A coach, a teacher, somebody else like that, if they have a close enough relationship with the person, they can cause them to develop these self-narratives. And the drinking word today will be internalize, okay? That people internalize this message, and any good therapy helps people step back and say, whoa, wait a second. I have all these assumptions, all these rules that guide me. I never questioned where they came from. I never questioned why they developed, and I haven't really been questioning whether they are, either adaptive to me today, or if they made sense when I was a child. If it made sense to be exceedingly deferential to a parent who raises gets angry very quickly, right? Does it make sense for me to be exceedingly deferential to everybody, to be passive, to not be able to assert my needs? It might have been functional in one capacity when I was a child, but later on, it's no longer, to have this rigid system that's still operating when it functions, sort of one function over here, but later in life, it's actually maladaptive, right? This rigidity can cause many problems. So yes, I just hope, and no one gets hung up on, what is this, who is the source of these different wounds or neuroses or bad programming. Okay. It's not the who, it's the why, and more importantly, the how. And how do we recognize and change them so they don't continue to undermine our functioning with other people, or in our work, or whatever else we're doing.
Yeah, and I'll use one of your ways of describing things when it comes to these types of wounds. They know, but they don't know, right?
Right.
So we can point it out, and it's often a lot of my clients will joke and laugh, saying like, "Oh, we're going to talk about my mom," and it's like, well, while that is a therapy cliche, it is something that is incredibly important to recognize, that it can play a role, where when we intellectually know that this is where a behavior or a maladaptive way of responding to things comes from, we may not be able to reconcile it in our hearts and be able to make a change with that. So it's really tricky that you, again, can know it, but making the change is a different thing, or recognizing it and recognizing where it shows up is completely different.
Exactly, and that's why when talking about the no versus the no, I also tell people, I say it's another cliche, but in dealing with this, you need self-compassion. You need to not have unrealistic expectations. Again, just knowing something doesn't magically make you change. Like how you feel about it and how you operate. More importantly, right? That's why I use the word. I use programming and conditioning. I go, it's baked in really deeply. So I say you need to be able to recognize that the knowledge is the first step, but that's only one step. And recognizing that even if every time I'm engaging with, whether it's the original person, whether my mother, or whether it's other people who represent her, or anyone else, okay, I have to know that all I can do is, first step, being aware that, oh, okay, I'm getting triggered in certain ways. I'm having certain, emotional or physiological reactions, right? I always tell people, you can't change. That's a reflex. You cannot change it at first. Okay, it's still going to happen. So you can't stop the reflex, but what you can do is contain it. You don't act on it. So your body, your physiology might react the same way, but you don't, again, you don't impulsively say something about it. You don't start spiraling and thinking a certain way. You don't start assuming that what the person said to me is actually valid, and when maybe they're just being hurtful or ignorant or something like that, right? You try to contain it. And I tell them, the more you contain it, the more you do not react the way that you used to. I say that's the reprogramming. And I say neurologically, physiologically, you are training yourself, right, to have a different reaction. And that's the process. And that's where self-compassion comes in, because most times you're not going to be doing that. Even if you commit to doing it, you're still going to take a long time to get in the habit. And B, even if you're doing it, it does take time. So you're still going to have that reaction. You still might, why did I say that? And so on. And once again, if you go to the original emotional or physiological reaction, you're being silly, because you can't stop it. Again, it's a reflex. The more you do it, it becomes smaller, and maybe one day it'll disappear. But I always tell people it'll still be, most likely be, a little
Yeah.
blip. But what's a
Yeah.
blip? You can easily contain a blip.
Yeah. And that actually, related but somewhat unrelated, reminds me of when clients are able to, address these things and recognize it and minimize that reaction, and in turn set really strong boundaries with mom or dad, or, whichever figure in their life has contributed to these wounds. Something really strange happens where, let's just pick on someone's mother, for example. The anger that some of these individuals receive in response to these boundaries is unreal. And that in and of itself can then take some work to reconcile and accept that this boundary is really important and the boundary was necessary because of this fractured relationship. But then the retaliation, again, is a whole other thing to deal with.
Right. And you use the key word that might be the drinking word of the day, which is boundaries. I'm going to play several, but and I tell people, okay, when people say what a boundary, with my mother or father, they assume boundary means barrier. And we may have said this, I can't remember if we talked about this before. I know you and I've talked about this a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. But a boundary is not, and I'll just reiterate it in case, people haven't heard this before, but a boundary is not a barrier per se. It may end up being one, maybe the only way to be able to assert your needs. But a boundary is simply communicating either explicitly or some other way that this is my expectation. These are my needs. This is how I plan to operate. And this is the way I would feel safe, comfortable, whatever, with you in this dynamic. And if you're not able to, kind of stay within those guardrails, then I need to either reinforce them or I need to, to maybe withdraw, whether in the moment, whether afterwards, and so on. I may need to change the nature of the relationship. If I've tried over and over to tell you these are my boundaries and you keep breaching them, then, and that's where the barrier might come up where I might say, you know what, I have to remove this person from my life, or I need to, temporarily take a break or something like that, whether I tell them outright or whether I kind of, sort of slowly withdraw. Right. But the point is, and I always tell people this, if you lay out the boundary in the most, let's say, what's the right word here? The most civil, the most respectful, where it's coming from me, these are my needs and so on. If you do that and the person keeps breaking or violating these boundaries, then if you need to walk away either temporarily or permanently, you can do so with a clean conscience, because that's the problem that a lot of people have. How could I walk away from my mother? How could I not, call my father on Father's Day or something like that? Well, if you know he's going to hurt you, if he has hurt you, if he continues to hurt you, right? Why are you like, what obligates you? I know there could be culture, there can be religion, there can be, family brainwashing, but practically speaking, what truly obligates you to subject yourself to that continued pain? So, it's all about reframing it. It's about seeing it from a healthy perspective. But unfortunately, in doing so, we are often going up against culture, tradition, guilt, brainwashing, and so on. When I say brainwashing, I don't mean literal brainwashing, but again, it's the programming basically.
Yeah. And I think we spoke about this within the context of the holidays, the Christmas holidays and so on. But it bears repeating. And again, within the context of Mother's Day and Father's Day, there is that built-in obligation of, well, how can I not reach out to my parent on that day? And you're absolutely right that even though somebody may know that they don't have to, there are often those obligations, expectations from other family, fear of judgment from other family members of, how could you do that to mom or to dad or whatever the case may be. And as hard as it is, ultimately, one has to do what's best for them and what's going to sit best with them, even if that means you're not meeting those expectations.
Right. And so people, they always, and we've talked about this before as well, I'm sure, people are afraid that, and they're often called this, that I'm being selfish. Okay. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, selfish is when you do something for your own self-interest and you don't care about the impact on others. Right. Self-interested is when you are prioritizing your well-being. And that, if you're telling the person, this is what I need in order for to preserve my well-being, and they just disregard it, so then who's being selfish? Right now, if they're being selfish, then you're going to self-preservation mode. And sometimes self-preservation requires you to be selfish, but you're only doing so because the other person is incapable or unwilling to respect your needs. And that's, again, it's all about the framing. Once again, and I say this to people, and I'll tell you right now, because I've got patients from many countries and cultural backgrounds where truly the parent is seen as the god, and you have to worship them, and they're infallible. And how dare you? Okay, and every single person, I keep hammering away gently, empathetically, and I say, I know where you're coming from. I'm not trying to make you go against all these things. I say, and that's one of your values that you were raised with. Fine, that's very good. However, did your parents themselves, look at how they were with their own parents. And many times they realize, oh, wait, they were hypocrites because
Yeah.
they weren't doing it. Okay. And B, I say, where in this whole narrative is the parent's obligation to the child to raise them with love and to not destroy them and to cause all these wounds and everything like that, right? C, again, I can't remember if we talked about this, but a lot of the cultures say that the parent, their obligation to the child is the first 18 years of life, and then the last 18 or 25 or whatever years is the child's obligation. I say, well, wait a second, that's a rigged contract because the parent made that decision without your consent. They brought you into the world. It's their responsibility to take care of you. And it would be nice if you return the favor if they've earned it. It's not automatic, right? Again, if they're going to set the stage, if they're going to bring you into the world, then again, it's 100% their obligation to do right by you. And if they don't do right by you, where does it say that you must then care for them in these later years? And again, when I'm not just talking about caring for someone who has health conditions, whatever, it's even, again, maintaining a relationship. I want to be very clear here. I don't casually or lightly tell people to disconnect from their family. I'm not saying that because there are some people who, I think, wantonly do that. I'm not saying that, right? I'm saying if it's so difficult, if it's so impossible, then you need to determine what is in my best interest, or if you have children, in my children's best interest. Do I want to expose them? In some cases, it's, well, the parent was a terrible parent, but they're a great grandparent. Okay, then how do you navigate that? And if you see that the grandparents are trying to manipulate the kids, manipulate you through the kids, or to use the kids as a tool or a weapon, well, I get it. The kids still want to see the grandparent, but if you're seeing this kind of toxic dynamic that you're exposing your children to, you have to be honest with yourself and say, wait, cost benefit analysis here. Is it really worth it? Okay. Or if I do, I have to really make sure the kids are protected and so on. So I know I'm throwing a whole bunch of stuff out there, but the point is, right, when we talk about parent wounds, it's very complicated. It affects you basically from birth, and also it doesn't just affect you, it affects the other people in your life.
Yeah, so I'll say a few things. So as far as that cost benefit analysis, that's a tricky one. And this is something I often will recommend clients frame the situation with is sometimes it's not going to be a positive outcome, but it's a matter of choosing the least worst option here. What feels worse, maintaining this toxic relationship or dealing with the pain of maybe disconnecting yourself altogether or creating a firm boundary or whatever the case may be? Neither of those is going to feel good, but which feels the least worst? And then as far as creating these boundaries, creating these, I guess, changes in the way that we're looking at relationships, because ultimately I think that everybody wants their parents' love and affection and approval, but the reality is some people weren't dealt that hand, and that's just how it is. And in adulthood, again, when people do begin working on this, it can feel a lot worse before it gets better, because you really have to dredge up, what contributed to this? What didn't I get? What did I need? And so on and so forth. So I think it's really important to recognize as well that, when one does start doing this work, whether with the therapist or, through their own reflection, it's going to feel a lot worse before it feels better.
100%. And we talked about this in a different podcast, but I kept alluding to grieving the loss of childhood or of good parents. And part of that process is saying, yeah, and that's where the self-compassion comes in. I didn't have the parents or the parent or the love or the guidance or validation or acceptance or whatever that my brain programmed me to need. Okay. We come into the world with this program, with this already preset programming that these are the people that we literally have to trust our lives with, right? And so when they fail in many different ways, yes, it's extremely impactful, and it leaves a huge a gaping hole or wound in yourself, and that's where the compassion comes in. So as an adult, I might be doing some messed up things, and nothing we're talking about is ever about making excuses, and it's never about blaming. It's about recognizing. Okay, with compassion, with the widest lens possible, and saying that, yeah, as an adult, maybe I am, I'm too quick to anger. Okay, well, as an adult, I need to be responsible for my anger, but I need to also not shame myself for doing that. I can be embarrassed, I can be upset, I can even be ashamed of something I've done. But shaming myself, that's not about what I've done. That's about myself as a human being. So I need to make sure that if I can recognize, again, it's not about excuses, but if I recognize, oh, that anger comes from this lack of validation or the abuse I suffered or neglect or something like that, then when I'm looking at myself as an adult, I can say, okay, I don't want to keep doing this. I need to work on this, but I have to understand it comes from a place. Doesn't come from it. That's not an adult reaction. That was my child brain being activated. And I need to now work on not allowing the child brain, to run amok. And that's where the containment comes in. And so again, because if I just go, oh, I'm such an idiot or I'm such an a-hole or something like that, again, I'm shaming myself, and shame does not motivate change, right? Shame just brings you down lower, and it makes it harder to climb back up into the person that you want to be and live in line with the values that you want to have.
Yeah, and I think that it's something I'll emphasize that you said there that is so, so important for people to recognize is that child self is often what is being triggered. So, sometimes what may feel like an irrational response to something is because that child is being triggered, and those emotions or those unmet needs are being triggered in that moment.
Yeah, and I always tell people, I say, I know it sounds hokey, okay, your inner child, whatever, however you want to call it,
Yeah.
right? But I say, yeah, again, it's that child needs compassion, and it's never about excuses. Okay. Because if a child's lighting posters on fire or throwing the cat in the microwave, I'm holding that child accountable. Okay. But so again, it's not about making excuses. Just recognize it comes from somewhere. And I can't I can't overemphasize the role of shame, because so many people carry this shame. And unfortunately, an unhealthy dynamic with let's say parents who've inflicted wounds on the person, shame, guilt, making them feel like a really bad person. That was part of their arsenal. That's how they either controlled or tried to control the child. Was through that, whether they did it knowingly or not. Sometimes it's ignorance. Other times it's malicious. But the shame, they carry the shame. That's the part of the programming. And then as an adult or a teen, whenever they're trying to deal with the target person, that they're still using the same tactics. And then, as you said earlier, people around them as well. How could you do that? It's Mother's Day, or it's Father's Day, or whatever. Right? It's just shame upon shame. So people have to recognize that. And once again, recognizing it will not change anything at first, but it is the first step.
Yeah. So speaking of guilt and shame, oftentimes this is even further intensified with aging parents and with the death of a parent. So we touched on this a bit in our episode about grief, but I think it bears some more conversation as far as a lot of really strange feelings can come up with the passing of a parent, or even, again, caregiving for an elderly parent, where there's a pull between the obligation of the family, of the culture, and what have you, and a feeling of, perhaps relief or happiness when a parent who was abusive, neglectful, whatever the case may be, has passed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And again, we talked about it before, but it's these unresolved issues. And with unresolved issues, let's say our memory of the past can be really distorted. And a monster who passed away, okay, you might forget the 95% of the monstrous things they did, and remember the few times that they maybe held you, or they gave you something, or you went on a trip to Disneyland or something like that. And then it's like your body is relieved, your body is happy maybe that this person is gone, but your conscious mind is going, but wait, they were a loving parent or something like that. So how could I be such a monster to feel this way? So it's really important to be able to step back and to truly process what happened, and to try again without this blame and shame and all this other stuff. It's just stepping back and saying, okay, I really want to reflect on this as honestly as possible, not to speak ill of the dead, okay, or anything like that, but just to see them realistically, to see the relationship realistically. It's not about blame. It's about understanding, because again, it won't change anything at the beginning, but without that understanding, change is impossible. And one other thing with understanding, there's two types of understanding. There's just a logical, intellectual understanding, which can help. Okay. You need that to some degree, but true insight doesn't just have that logical understanding. It has that emotional resonance as well. So that's where you can't just rush through it. You can't just try to muscle through it with logic. It's whether talking to a family member or to a therapist or something like that, somebody who can say something, to ask something, to remind you of something that might just hit you from a way that you hadn't expected. Because when you go down the logical path, you see things in a way that you've seen it many times. You're already conditioned to think that way. But with the right person, a good therapist, for example, they can say things or ask things that make you see it from a different perspective. And that can open things up. And you can have that emotional resonance that can better facilitate the rest of the change internally and also externally in how you relate to others.
So, in addition to all the things that we've said, I guess in the context of what people can do with all of this, I think that something that we maybe didn't touch on is the role of personal accountability. So I think that there is a fine line between recognizing these attachment wounds, recognizing the role that one's parents' shortfalls may have played in our adult lives. But it's also important to recognize when one is an adult that you can make these changes, that you can have these really difficult reflections. And with some work, you can overcome the pain that's come along with these attachment wounds.
Right. And again, it's so tricky because I have so many patients who, when it comes to personal accountability, unfortunately, it's an unhealthy perspective. They're holding their child self accountable. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, wait a second. You were a kid, right? Yeah, you might have been a brat. You might have been this, and that. But, right, your parents were the adults in the room. They were the ones who were supposed to try to find a way to help you navigate through what you're going through, or to guide you, to teach you, to raise you to be a model citizen or whatever. So when the person blames themselves, and I've seen it, and again, intellectually they get it, but there's different types of therapy that help the people transcend the intellectual, and they really feel it emotionally. And that's where the resonance comes. And that's when they can have a shift. Again, it won't make everything change, but it starts to kind of open things up where change is possible.
Absolutely. So what do our listeners think? What are some things that perhaps you've witnessed or experienced when it comes to attachment wounds? Let us know in the comments.
Okay, now there's a few other things before we get to that. I just want to add a few other things for people to think about. And I did mention this in this session on grief, but one of the techniques that's called empty chair. And whether you do this therapy called empty chair, which is emotion-focused therapy and a Gestalt type of approach, or you just conceptualize it, I think it's so important for people to understand. I guess I'll say two things, okay? Especially when it comes to old parent wounds, okay, is this idea that you're going to have a mixture of emotions. There's going to be the hurt, the longing, the grievances, the anger, the betrayal, the fear, and everything. And to recognize that you're going to be ping-ponging among all these different emotions, either when you're thinking about the person or when you're engaging with them. So it's really important, again, whether through therapy or through thinking about it yourself, to process these emotions kind of almost individually. Let me look at the anger, okay? Without feeling bad about having that anger, to recognize if my parent did this to me, either as an adult or as a child, okay, that I have that right to be angry, okay? I have that right to hold the resentments, to be hurt and whatever. I may be an adult, but, my mother says something to me that was hurtful. If it was anybody else who said it to me, not a problem, okay? But either A, if it's something that, triggers something that, a wound from before, all right, then again, it's not the adult brain being operating, it's the child brain. And to recognize that, I'm not being a big baby if it hurts like that. Let me look at that. And again, let me try to process that with self-compassion. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, this is just a crazy phenomenon. I may have mentioned it before, about, oh my gosh, the repetition compulsion, or the compulsion to repeat, just because you asked about Freud at the beginning. So kind of bring it back a little bit of call back here. Okay. For people to recognize just how powerful, actually, I'll say one more thing after this story. Okay. But just to recognize how powerful, not just the wounds, but the dynamics are to our sense of self and how we operate. So the old saying that we marry, or we go after someone who's like one of our parents. Okay. Well, there's several different ways one can look at that. One can look at it sort of from the cognitive behavioral perspective, which is, well, this is what we're familiar with. This is what we're used to. So if we meet somebody who has similar traits to our parents, that's where we feel the most, is comfortable, or at least familiar. So we're inclined to find someone like that. That's just conditioning. But the deeper way of looking at, the more Freudian way, or the psychoanalytic way, is that and again, this is not, by the way, it's not conscious, it's all unconscious, seems so irrational. But if I find someone who's like, let's say, my mother, then again, unconsciously, it's all unconscious, then I'm going to be engaging with this person very similarly to how I probably engage with my mother. If my mother was a cold person and I'm attracted to cold people, then I'm going to have the type of interpersonal problems that come from having a cold partner. Okay. And if I I'm able to resolve these problems with my partner in the present, somehow that magically will resolve the wounds from the past with my mother. Different person altogether, different actual, problems, but somehow that similar process internally will heal me. And it sounds ridiculous, but A, when I frame it that way with patients, so many of them go, oh my gosh, I can actually see it. It makes sense. Okay. And B, when I talked about that emotion focused therapy, that empty chair technique, the reality is when people do it, when I have patients do it, most of them, not everyone can do it, but when the people do it, the next week they come back and go, oh my gosh, something has changed. And they did not talk to their parent. They talked to a chair and they role played their parent in that chair. Again, I'm not doing it justice, but the point is through this symbolic exercise in therapy, somehow it really led to this shift inside. They feel something different. So if that can happen, in the symbolic chair work, then why wouldn't it happen with a real person when you are, again, as an adult, you hope dealing with certain problems in a more adaptive way, right? With using the adult brain, not the child brain, because when you were a child and you had this problem with your parent or as a teen, you didn't have the same brain as you have now. So you should have, better functioning to be able to resolve it better. And that can somehow internally lead to some kind of resolution. Again, it's all operating on the unconscious, and it won't magically make you feel better, and it won't fix your problem with your parents, but it is one piece of that. Okay. So,
and I guess I'll add something to that while you're saying that oftentimes clients will bring to session a question of, well, should I talk to my parent about this? Should I write them a letter? Should I broach this? And most of the time, right, wrong, or otherwise, my response is no, you probably shouldn't, because if at this stage in life they're still engaging in this behavior, chances are they're not going to be receptive or accountable to any feedback that you have to give. Sometimes it can be helpful. Sometimes, even for the individual to get it all out can be helpful. But my response is usually because you can't go into those interactions expecting that the parent is going to take full accountability and all of a sudden understand the error of their ways.
Right. So to that point, I'm going to contradict that a little bit. Okay. I agree with the premise 100%. If someone thinks, oh yes, I'm going to use these tools, or I went to therapy and everything, so I'm going to approach my parent and I'm going to hash it out and I'm going to resolve it. Yeah. In 99 out of 100 times, you're not, or maybe 100 out of 100, you're not going to get that resolution. Okay. So I remember with one patient where I won't get into all the details, but basically it was the same idea. They wanted to confront their parents about this problem. And so we spent the whole session. I said exactly how they're going to say it, how they're going to frame it, and what they can expect from their parents and how they can counter that, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, they were like really hopefully, oh, wow, do you think it's going to work? I said, of course not. Okay. And then they look at me, they go, well, then why do we spend the entire session, setting me up for failure? I said, because here's the thing. And here's where I differ with you. Okay. I say, here's the thing. It's not, for all the reasons that you said, I said, they're not going to magically see the error of the ways. They're going to act. And I can predict how they're going to act based on what you told me. I said, here's the thing. If you can go in there, and this is tricky. And this is why I agree with you that if someone isn't able to do this, it's going to be totally futile. But if they can do this, it can be somewhat healing, which is I say, you're going to go into that interaction. Okay. You're going to present yourself a certain way. You're going to say all these things and you can predict how they're going to be. They're not going to be responsive or receptive. They're going to gaslight you. They're going to do whatever. They're going to be defensive. They're going to, play the victim or whatever they've always done. And the magic is if while they're doing that, you're able to contain yourself, okay, and not get triggered. You'll get a little bit triggered, but if you can contain it and just conduct yourself like an adult, I say that's where some of the healing can come in, because now you have that adult brain and you're dealing with childhood wounds, but with an adult brain perspective. And if you can do that, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe 5 times, and you're able to, again, walk out of there going, I conducted myself well. I took the high road. And I'm not surprised. I tell them, you're most likely not going to get a resolution. It's not about that. It's about going back into the same place, but conducting yourself better internally and externally. And that's why with the repetition compulsion, it's a very similar thing. The only difference is you're doing it with another person. It's not your parent, it's your partner. Okay. And unfortunately, we hope in those cases you'll actually resolve something. So the resolution there really does help healing it. So with the parent where you're not going to get the resolution, just being able to go through the same process, but conducting yourself differently, right? Adult brain, dealing with childhood wounds, there is something to it. It won't matter. Again, I don't want people to have false hope. It doesn't make everything change, but it does lead to something, and it does help them kind of unhook themselves from these past dynamics. Because again, it's not just how I see myself with my parent. It's not just how I interact with my parent. We know that those internalized dynamics then play out with other people, whether it's authority figures, partners, siblings, colleagues, whatever else like that. So if I can go back to the source and have and be able to conduct myself better, I have a better chance of being able to do that with other contemporaries in my life.
I guess one more thing I'll add there is in the absence of being able to successfully do that, another therapy modality that can be very helpful, and I've seen be very helpful for a number of clients, is EMDR, where you are actually tapping into both that wisdom of the adult brain and the pain of, the inner child or the child brain, and helping to, and I'm very much oversimplifying, but kind of from a neurological perspective, marrying the highways of logic and emotion and helping to reconcile a lot of those difficult feelings. And I've seen great success with that.
Yes, and that's exactly what I was saying earlier about that. Now, if it's pure logic, without that emotional resonance, that doesn't lead to the change. But the EMDR, as you say, it's the marrying of the two pathways, and it can lead to some change, whether it's through that, whether it's empty chair, however it is. But again, very few people can just muscle their way through logically. You need that emotional resonance. That's the child brain, so to speak. So, all right, I guess on that note, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.